Hey, well, firstly, let's get the patsy out of the way. Happy birthday, Minister.
Thank you so much, Simon. Somebody said you sing.
I sing. We'll see how the chat goes. Must be good to make it into your 40s.
It's good to remember my 40s. Yeah, thanks so much for that. I miss your friendly banter and candour. I'm a little bit worried about US-New Zealand trade relations with you on the stage asking questions, but let's get into it.
I suppose, and I appreciate everything we've said, but that's as I say, boring, that we don't yet have a detailed sense of it. But your best estimate of what might be coming on tariffs from the United States to New Zealand and how we deal with that?
Well, I think it's clear that there will be tariffs somewhere around the world. Exactly where they are, what they are, as others have said, are yet to unfold. But I think the point you made earlier, and we were discussing it last night, I was the trade minister when President Trump was elected the first time round. He pulled out of the TPP. There was a lot of doom and gloom. In that period of time, New Zealand was able to put that agreement back together with others, and there were significant large New Zealand companies who had a good presence in the US market that were worried. Actually, some of them thought they probably wouldn't stay there. They would look to elsewhere in the world. And they say to me quietly, they're very pleased they didn't pull out because actually under a Trump administration, not only did the economy grow, their trade grew and New Zealand's trade grew. So I'm a lot more optimistic than much of what you might read in the newspapers, but it's clear that there is uncertainty around the world. And we know that when there is uncertainty, that's not necessarily good for economies or trade.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do go on Slido. We will use your questions in this slot. We've got time for that. I suppose just, Todd, more broadly on the Trump administration, what do you see in store for us economically, and how do you play it?
Yeah, well, the US economy is likely to grow over the next 3 or 4 years. How much we'll see, the reasons for that, we'll also get to see. It'll be very interesting around taxation, what happens. But there is an expectation amongst many Americans in the US that their economy will grow and they will be better off. And when Americans are better off, we know they spend more historically. That has been good for New Zealand and New Zealand exporters. Our trade with the US is extremely complementary. Under the Trump administration, I was one of the first ministers in our government then to be able to go up to the White House and had a very wide-ranging number of meetings, including with Ambassador Lighthizer and the Secretary of Commerce, and made the case then that actually back then we bought more from the US than we sold them, and we were actually okay with that because it was extremely complementary. Now, if you add all trade together, it still remains more or less fairly balanced at the moment. And I think it's a very important message to portray or talk about. For any economy of the world where the trade is unbalanced, where one side is much more reliant upon the other, then you come under domestic pressure to put in place protections and barriers. We've seen that a lot. But the final thing I guess I would say for New Zealand exporters, and with both David and Damien here, former trade ministers, I don't know a time that it's ever been easy for New Zealanders to trade around the world. There's always protection, there's always barriers, we're always further away from markets than anybody else. We're smaller than they are, and I back Kiwis to do well everywhere, including in the US over the next 3 or 4 years.
What I'm taking for what you're saying is you, dare I say, a little bit like me and one or two others in the discussion we've had, you're presenting a case for optimism here?
Well, there was a conference here a couple of weeks ago in New Zealand where a UK economist, I think, dialed in, and he was talking about this government, our ambitious target. We're committed to doubling exports by value over 10 years. And he said anybody that's committed to that at the moment with international headwinds and geopolitical is either delusional or a trade minister. And I guess the point is you can be both.
Or both, yeah.
You can be both, right? So the point here is, and my colleagues in the room, I'm sure will agree, you have to be optimistic about this stuff because you can talk yourself into doom and gloom and you can stay at home and therefore it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, do I think the next couple of years is going to be easy in the world? No. But I think even if there wasn't changes in leadership in many democracies around the world, Would it be easy for New Zealand? No, it's always hard, but we should back ourselves and we can get out there. We have a very constructive, long-term, stable relationship with the US. We've demonstrated from different administrations, we can do well. And actually, I do see real opportunity for New Zealand, both business and government, in the US over the next 3 or 4 years.
You've met Lighthizer. For me, it's a mere mortal without the great briefings of Beating Co. It's hard to keep up with exactly where the administration's appointments are at, but it looks like he could well be the person again. How'd you get on with him? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, we don't know yet who will be the USTR, the US Trade Representative, and whoever it is, again, will be able to work with them. But as with David said, I got to know Bob Lighthizer quite well, got on very well. I have a lot of respect for him, actually. There's not a lot of dissimilarity between his view of how a domestic economy should do well than ours, although in some areas, you know, we come from a very different place. I too have a story about him. The very first time I met him, I think, was an ASEAN meeting in Singapore, and he had just come through the appointment process, and we had the family photograph, which is where all of the ministers stand up there in front of the world's cameras, and there was a very tall man beside me that everybody had been shaking hands with, and I said, "Hello, my name's Todd McClay from New Zealand." He said, "I'm Bob from the US," and so that's the way I got to meet him. We sat beside each other at lunch. Anyway, we were talking a little bit, and he told me that in the state he grew up in, he loved fly fishing, and I told him a bit about where I come from, Rotorua. So when I went up to the White House to meet him, I thought about, so MFAT always give you gifts, and they don't always, they're not always rememberable. So I thought I will go along to a local fishing shop in Rotorua, and they had this fishing box to put fishing flies in that came from his home state. So I bought it, and I got a whole lot of fishing flies that were made locally and put them in. I brought them up and gave them to him and invited him down, and he thought it was a wonderful gift, although he did say the fishing box, he said, was probably made in China, which I suggested demonstrates the benefits of world trade. But the point of this is, and it may not be a true story, it's been told to me, I'm going to use it anyway. We had an election change. David Parker became the minister, and I'm told that each time he saw Bob Lighthizer around the world, Bob thanked him for the fishing flies and how he just caught another one. So the point of this is, actually, as memorable as trade ministers aren't, we get on very, very well. And it's a bit that I think Greg Foran was talking about, the ability to be familiar, but also needing to be, and rememberable, but also needing to be professional. So I think that if it is Bob Lighthizer, he knows New Zealand, he knows it very well. He's known successive trade ministers. If it's not, we will work hard to continue to have a positive relationship with the USTR, and we'll find ways to work together in the US, and dare I say it, around the world.
It's funny, when I was up on the panel before, it flashed through my head and I was talking about you. You know, my enduring thought about Todd is, and I decided not to say this, I thought it didn't have the requisite respectfulness for a trade minister of New Zealand, but this is a guy who works out what you like. If it's licorice, all sorts, the next time he meets you, he'll have some in his pocket, right? That's the sort of guy this guy is. What would your talking points be with the trade representative or whoever it is you meet on your next occasion, do you think?
Well, I think we're going to be quite realistic and quite practical. And again, when I met Bob Lighthizer the first time, we then had a formal bilateral meeting, and we sort of sat down and, you know, said lunch was enjoyable. And I said to him, so there'll be a lot of TPP ministers sort of talking to you about TPP. He said, yep. I said, well, I'm not going to. I'm a realist. I know what's happened. You're not going to join. I accept that, so we should not talk about that. But actually, New Zealand needs you playing a role around trade around the world, in the WTO and elsewhere. We all need to shape the rules together, because if we're not doing that, then actually, whomsoever does shape those rules, we may not like that. And he went on to sort of talk to the media and others about, whilst they had a different view, they weren't abdicating a responsibility to actually be in a place to help set rules around the world. And I think others have said it today, you know, the US administration is not saying they don't like rules, they do, but they like rules that work for them and work for everybody. And they, as some New Zealanders, businesses would say, the rules don't always work. And so, you know, it's not myopically saying, let's just agree something that is good for everybody. Let's have rules that work. And so, my view would be we just have to be pragmatic over the next little bit of time. A lot of journalists are sort of asking us, what do we think is going to happen? It's been a few weeks since the election. It's a couple more months until the administration is in place. We should show them the respect and courtesy to allow them to go through that process. There's an awful lot of appointments that need to be made. The President has the right to appoint the people that he wants if he can get them through his system. Then we've got to roll up his sleeves and get on and work constructively, and New Zealand has a great track record in that area.
I mean, noting what you just say, I can suspect, I know you answer your question, but I mean, the likes of these multilateral organisations that have mattered so much in the past, the WTO, plenty others we could talk about, I mean, is there a sense they're going to be increasingly irrelevant, or do they still have a very significant role?
Well, for a country like New Zealand, the WTO is one of the most important bodies there because it is where we get to talk about fairness in trade and work through the various issues. It has delivered for New Zealand and it's delivered for every country, but it's certainly not perfect. And if you think about what happened when President Trump was in his first term as president, he actually didn't say that he didn't like the WTO, he said it's not working, and he took issue with the dispute settlement system. And I have some sympathy for that view. It needs to be worked on, it needs to be fixed, it needs to be reinforced, it needs to be respected. Probably one of the greatest failings over the last period of time of the WTO is that it hasn't been able to come together and make a decision around dispute settlement that works for all countries. We should double and redouble efforts to do that, because without the WTO, world trade is not better, it's much worse. But we shouldn't just keep doing what's happening there because we've always done it. New Zealand's a country we need to continue to reflect and improve. The WTO is certainly, as many multilateral institutions need upgrading from time to time. In New Zealand, many countries of the world have a willing partner to get systems like that working properly.
Thanks for that. I think Fonterra is a valued partner in today. I asked this question on their behalf. They haven't asked me to ask it, by the way, but we know under Trump previously, he had a few views on NAFTA, on Canadian dairy. I know you've got a few views. I know that's heating up. Give us a sense of that.
Yeah, well, that's right. Dairy trade is probably the most protected in the world, and of all of the commodities, food's probably the most subsidised as well. We're very fortunate that we produce high-quality, safe food, meat and dairy that largely is grass-fed, and we know much of the world wants it. New Zealand enters into agreements clear-eyed. We honour our obligations through trade agreements and elsewhere, and we expect others to treat us in the same way. And you mentioned Canada. Very unfortunately, under the CPTPP, they're not. The Labor government started a dispute process last year under the CPTPP. A dispute panel was called. We supported them in that in opposition. That panel found in our favour. Unfortunately, Canada is still not meeting their obligation, and so we have decided to continue with that and reserve the right to take whatever action we deem appropriate on behalf of New Zealand to stand up for our rights, because if you're going to sign a trade deal, you should honour it. Now, the interesting thing around that is that comes to the various things you can do, including we have options available to us to put tariff rates back in place upon exports from Canada to New Zealand, and that gets you to that whole debate that we have about whether tariffs are good or bad or not. And I guess the point that I would be making is that actually none of this is clear-cut, and there will be many reasons why different economies may consider, raising barriers and bringing them down. New Zealand believes in free trade. Our economy has seen the benefits of free trade. Protectionism does not help, does not work. Doesn't mean there are not occasions or times when economies consider them, as we may be forced to with Canada, but actually the ball is in their court and time is not up yet, although they're running out of time to meet their obligation.
I take it from that you agree with the President-elect's comments that tariffs the greatest invention by man ever.
No, that would be fishing flies.
Let's go to some of these questions. Really good questions here, all from Ms. Anonymous. What risks?
It's from David Parker.
David, stop putting the questions in. All right. You're on, David. Do you hold David responsible for this bloody stupid CPTPP? I mean, TPP was so much simpler.
Well, I think one of the it had two less words in it. I think one of the things though that is clear, and it doesn't give us certainty as to where we're heading, but it does happen from time to time. In opposition, the things you campaign on, you don't always get to do in the same way when you come to a government. And I think there was a lot of opposition when we were in government around the TPP, and parts of it have changed. Much of it under the TPP remained the same. An incoming Labor government did embrace that and accepted it and put it into law, which is good for New Zealand. I was probably more critical in opposition than I would be in government around the European Union Free Trade Agreement that we started and Labor concluded and signed. We were able to get into force. It's not a perfect agreement, but there is nothing that happens in trade that's perfect anywhere. And so I think that's the reason, as others have said today, and as far as what the next year or two has in store, and as far as things that were campaigned on in the US and may well be delivered on, it's too soon to know. Certainly, there is a change of government and direction in the US, as there has been in New Zealand from an election last year. That's democracy, but will all the things that are campaigned on happen? I'm not sure they all will.
Questions here from Slido. What risks do you see for our China trade given NZ's Indo-Pacific and US Five Eyes security emphasis?
Yeah, well, we're working very, very hard to ensure that our trading relationships around the world remain intact, and we strengthen them and invest in them. But we have an independent foreign policy. It has flown from government to government, and we have the ability and the right to stand up for the things that are important to New Zealanders. And we should do so both directly with countries around the world, respectfully, and also publicly. And this government, as the last government, is very clear in wanting to do that. And so we also have the ability, though, with all nations of the world we have a relationship with, to actually have differences of views and opinions without it letting it ruin a relationship. So I mentioned Canada earlier, and I'm very, very intent in ensuring they either meet their obligation or they pay New Zealand compensation, because we entered into a deal. However, we're very good friends with Canada. We work constructively together. We do a lot on the world stage, particularly in trade. This won't ruin that relationship. It's just that we have a disagreement and a different view, and we have that ability with many countries of the world, including the US and China, to have a constructive relationship in areas that we work well together, but it doesn't mean we have to agree on everything.
Another question here, it's got a lot of lights, quite an intriguing question. Will there be closer tripartite ties and cooperation between Australia and New Zealand when dealing with the United States, such as common currency and markets and defence?
Well, I think the answer is yes, and there will be opportunities for that. And we have a very long history of cooperation in all of those areas. And we should, like-minded countries, should find things to do together, to bring down barriers, to find ways to trade with each other, but putting what we want to buy and sell aside, those people-to-people links. New Zealand has the ability and the demonstrated history of doing that with many different parts of the world. We have an and strategy in trade. We want to trade with the US and China and the EU and the UK and Southeast Asia, and those two trade deals were just done in the GCC and the UE, and of course, and India. We want to open up opportunities and level the playing field for New Zealanders, and then have them make the decisions, much more in the government, as to risk and where they want to put their effort and that desire to diversify. And the previous government of National, the Labor government, and this government continues in that direction.
There's a lot on China there, obviously. And for obvious reasons. Another one here, how concerned are we about China's Belt and Road Initiative in the Pacific, particularly if Trump struggles to engage with other Pacific nations?
Well, that's something that we've discussed previously. The Belt and Road is not something that we see as necessarily something we'll move forward with in New Zealand at this time. But again, we have a constructive relationship, economic relationship with China, and it's one of our most important economic relationships, But I guess very, very clearly, New Zealand plays a big role in the Pacific, particularly with the Pacific Islands, as Australia does. And I would simply say to all other countries of the world that actually the Pacific is a place where we can work constructively together to help develop those economies and improve the quality of life and standard of living and the welfare of those Pacific Islanders. We should do that respectfully as neighbours and as equals, and New Zealand has a big obligation in that area, given not only our history, our geographical positioning to them.
A couple of questions here. Got a lot of likes, really about this point we've discussed around US trade growing, actually in the absence of an FTA, and so one of the questions is what other actions beyond FTAs are the government taking to stay engaged globally and help the export goal? And the other one, are there benefits and other structures that can still bring economies close together, maybe focused on supply chain security?
Yeah, most certainly. So free trade agreements, or actually I just want to call them trade agreements now, because there's nothing free in trade anymore. And that word free trade agreement jumps back a couple of decades to things that don't happen anymore. A trade agreement that has just no rules, otherwise sell as much as you want. These are just trade agreements now, and there are lots of different types of them. But ultimately all they do is create a set of rules that businesses can rely upon. And businesses won't like all of those rules, but they give them certainty. And if a business has certainty, it can then make decisions for itself as to where it wants to invest effort and capital, and trade grows as a result. So there are still opportunities around the world for trade agreements. We've been able to conclude 2 this year, or the GCC, after 18 years of unfinished business for many governments, and it's a high quality one that will give New Zealand exporters not only opportunity, it'll give them a benefit and preference over others in the market, and the UAE. We're working very, very hard to deepen and broaden that relationship in all facets with India, including, of course, we want there to be trade. But in setting the ambitious target of doubling exports by value over 10 years, I've also said I want to judge the success of New Zealand's trade policy by as much by how much extra we trade, as by the number of deals that we do. And so in that, we've got to use these trade agreements more, help our exporters to go up the value chain. And the other thing we've got to do is get barriers down. So away from tariff rates, these technical barriers to trade and non-tariff barriers to trade. We've said we want a real focus on this on behalf of the business community. We've got rid of about 16 or fixed 16 this year, fully or partially or temporarily, worth about $700 million worth to the New Zealand economy, or affecting $700 million worth of exports. We've lined up another 900 million of exports next year that are restricted, and they are all around the world, and we'll just have to keep doing that. So the answer is, yep, we should look at supply chains and do agreements around that, so that we can get goods and services to markets more easily. But fundamentally for New Zealand, there have always been barriers. There always will be. They're in every single country that we trade with. Our job as a government is to join with the business community, find those barriers, and continually successfully work to reduce them and get them out of the way, so Kiwi exporters can sell more.
A couple of questions just while we're on trade agreements. You've done a good job, a really good job this year of getting some done. Do you see more in the very near term coming up?
Well, I think there will always be opportunities, and we're going to keep looking, and it's very kind of you to say I've done a good job. We have an exceptional team of trade negotiators and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I often say when I go overseas, as David and Damien would have, we go to these big meetings around the world, and you turn up with 2 or 3 people, and the Australians have got 20 and the Americans have got hundreds, and they come with their airplanes, and man for man, woman for woman, we do better as a small economy of 5 million people. So we are really well looked after with our trade negotiators, and they're professional and they work hard. But the answer is yes, there must always be more. It's just a matter of matching that talent and the amount of capacity we have against where. It's not for today, but I think in a decade from now, the world will be starting to say, gee, there's a few bright spots of opportunity in parts of Africa. I don't think we can rush off and do a trade deal in Africa tomorrow. I think it's very, very difficult, but there will be a time in the near future where we'll want to start thinking about putting a bit of effort in there, because what we have to do is be ahead of the curve, not playing catch up. We do that occasionally with a few parts of the world, but if we end up in Africa 15 years from now when the rest of the world has done deals, then actually we'll be missing out. And so we should continue to challenge ourselves as to where next and what we want to do, but we've also got to be realistic that we won't be able to do trade deals with every part of the world, and sometimes saying no will be just as important for our efforts to the business community than saying yes to everything.
I mean, you made the point earlier, which I fundamentally accept, that certainly high quality free trade agreements, that's in much harder, if not impossible weather. We know the nature of what we're trading. Certainly if we think of the United States has moved from, and I'm not knocking the traditional things we've been strong in terms of goods, but much more services oriented. We're seeing in these agreements, environmental chapters, indigenous chapters, all these things. Talk to us, some will have a lot of technical expertise, but talk to us as lay people about how trade agreements and the work you're doing has and it continues to change.
It has changed and it must. So I'm a little more old-fashioned around trade agreements. They are there just to get trade barriers down. And, there's an argument out there that says if you want to deal with climate change, you should do it in a climate change agreement rather than a trade agreement. However, in trade, it's not just about buying and selling. And so we have to stand up and speak about the values that New Zealanders have at the same time, as opposed to just ignoring them and say we're just going to sell to anybody in the world. That's why actually with the GCC agreement, I think New Zealand can take a lot of pride. So it's the best quality, highest quality deal the GCC has done with anybody so far. It is their first one with a major agricultural export nation, but we've also been able to agree language and sections in the agreement that for them are the first time. So a commitment to ILO labour standards. There are chapters and information there about the environment and climate changes, of course, and sustainable trade as there should be. For the very first time, a commitment, there's a section on women's economic empowerment, and the first time a commitment to a UN convention that is against all forms of discrimination against women. Now that's a very, very big step forward in conversation with many parts of the world, particularly that part of the world. And it was important to New Zealand, it's important to our value, and it's there. And I suspect as we go forward, other countries of the world will want to do trade deals with them, and they'll pick that language up, should they choose to, and may well take it further. But fundamentally, trade agreements are getting barriers down so we can trade more easily and to back New Zealand exporters, give them opportunities in other parts of the world, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't stand up for our values also.
Two more questions, one from the audience, one from me. Last one from the audience. What potential do you see for technology-based exports, e.g. software, space, medtech? How can the government support these sectors?
So that's huge. We've got to be very careful when we're talking about trade. We're not just talking about meat and dairy, because New Zealand is so much more than that now. It's a really important part of our profile, and the primary sector is, as Minister of Agriculture, the most important part of the economy. Our farmers work hard every day and they deserve our respect and our thanks. But where the real potential is now and in the future for better jobs, higher paying jobs, jobs that people can take all over the world, and the way that we double those exports by value over 10 years is by really leading into the tech sector and into services. That's why actually the two deals we've just done in the Middle East have a very big services component to them. And we're already seeing New Zealand companies up there and wanting to go up to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, to be involved in the trillions of dollars they're spending to grow their infrastructure, and services and our people. But tech really will be at the forefront of this. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity to sort of not even ride the wave, but decide what you're standing on the wave when you're riding it now and into the future. And that's one of the reasons that Judith Collins has started a lot of work to focus on the tech environment in New Zealand. How can we attract more investment into tech in New Zealand? How can we get it to stay an anchor here? We don't have a problem with startups in New Zealand. Kiwis have wonderful ideas all of the time. We have a problem with sort of gearing up and growing those companies and then keeping them here as they go out to the rest of the world. And there are many, many companies that give a great example that it's possible here, and it's unfair to just single one out. But if you look at what's happened with Rocket Lab and how proud we should be of that compared to every other country of the world bar a couple, our space industry is not only growing, actually in the case of, I think, Japan, we put more rockets into space for them than anybody else does now in the world, or satellites, not rockets. And that's a real demonstration of cooperation between New Zealand and the US, particularly the tech space. And it's something that our government is proud of, and it's something that the US government should be very, very proud of as well. So we can prove, we've demonstrated we can do it. We have just now need to actually get a few regulatory settings right in New Zealand, and I think technology will play a very important role in New Zealand's economic future.
Yeah, totally right. you have done a great job on trade diversification in just a year. I'd say you had, even if you hadn't, but you have. My question is this. With China, yes, growing, but sluggish. With America, a new president, much more protectionist, and go on and on. Is your target or aspiration of doubling trade in a decade still realistic? Or have you given up on that?
No, I haven't given up on it at all. It's an ambitious target, and we should always strive for things that are difficult to achieve. And I've set that target purposefully to to focus the minds of government and government agencies, but actually what surprised me is how much the business community have said yes, they're up for it as well. You've got to set targets. Businesses do it all the time. Governments always should. You should set targets that are hard to achieve, not ones that are easy to achieve. Because actually, as we move towards this over the next decade, we will export more. We will find ways to get greater value for what we're exporting. We will become more productive and will become more efficient. We'll create more jobs in New Zealand that pay more, because companies that export pay their workers more, and the New Zealand economy will become wealthier. And I would say to you that against predictions, again, when President Trump was elected the first time around, our trade with the US grew. So there's a question on here that says, what's your prediction on the value of our ag and wine exports to the US over the next presidential term? The economy will grow, and Americans will be like people everywhere else in the world. They want the world's best beef and the world's best wine, and in that, we have a role to play.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Todd's birthday. I'm not above sycophancy, but I'm not going to sing him happy birthday. I don't need anything from him right now. The camera's on, they think I am, I'm not, don't worry. What I do have, though, is a slightly sycophantic, I'm going to say chocolate cake for your birthday. Happy birthday, Todd. We wish you a great rest of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Todd McClay.
Thank you so much.